Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the Appalachian Mountains. Leave a comment about where you're watching from because you're about to learn about a mystery that doesn't make sense. This video is not real. It was made up for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is just a coincidence. Picture the Appalachian Mountains in the year 1908. It's not just a remote area. It's a real maze of deep valleys, thick forests, and towns that are so far apart that silence almost feels like a physical thing. It was a place where poorly marked dirt roads wound their way through misty peaks, and where nature still ruled over the few people who lived there. At that time, West Virginia was a place of stark contrasts. The first railroads were starting to come in, but most people still lived like their grandparents did, depending on the land, hunting, and a deep distrust of strangers. Our story starts in a small village called Thornwood, which is in the middle of County Greenbrier. There were only a few wooden houses in the village, which was so small that it didn't even show up on most maps of the time. The village was in a narrow valley surrounded by mountains that looked like they were touching the sky. The people who lived there had simple lives. They worked on small farms, cut wood, or mined coal deep in the mountains. The church was the center of social life, and the pastor, Elijah Mand, was seen as the voice of reason and morality in a community that still believed in old superstitions. But there was something about Thornwood that always bothered people who went through it. People who traveled through the area to get to bigger cities sometimes said they felt like the forest was always watching them. Some people said it was just because they had been alone on the trails for days, but others insisted there was something more, something that couldn't be explained by imagination alone. The trees there were thicker, the valleys were darker, and the fog would often come down from the mountains without warning, making the world a place where the lines between reality and fantasy were hard to see. That fall, when the leaves started to change color and the air got colder, something strange started to happen in Thornwood. It wasn't just one strange thing that happened, but a series of them that could each be written off as a coincidence. There were the animals first. Farmers noticed that their hens stopped laying eggs and that their cows were restless at night, mooing all the time as if they could sense something terrible coming. The dogs, which were known for being brave enough to face bears and other predators, started howling together every night. The sound echoed through the valleys and kept the people awake, making them nervous. Then the people who lived there told their own stories. Margaret Hartley, a woman known for being practical and not fanciful, said she saw strange lights dancing among the trees near her property. She said the lights were pale spheres that moved on their own, going up and down the mountain slopes as if they were looking for something. The next morning, her husband Thomas went to look into it and found only strange footprints in the mud. They didn't look like they belonged to any animals that lived in the area. They were too big to be from a bear, but they were shaped like something heavy had dragged something across the ground. Other people who lived there started to have similar things happen. Samuel Briggs, a lumberjack, said that while he was working alone in the woods, he heard voices that seemed to call his name. However, the voices stopped suddenly when he tried to get closer. A merchant who lived on the edge of the village woke up one night feeling like someone was watching his house. When he looked out the window, he saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the forest, not moving at all. He screamed, and the figure just disappeared, as if the darkness had eaten it. Pastor Mand tried to calm his church members down by telling them that these were just tricks of the mind brought on by being alone and the cold weather. He set up church meetings where he talked about faith and courage, but even he couldn't hide how uncomfortable he was. The truth is that Mand had gone through something that really upset him. One night, while walking home after visiting a sick member of the church, he thought someone was following him. He looked back several times but only saw the trees' shadows in the dim light of the moon. But when he got home and shut the door, he could clearly hear heavy footsteps going around his property. The footsteps went on for hours before stopping just before dawn. As October went on, things in Thornwood got more and more tense. People started locking their doors earlier, stayed inside at night, and whispered about what might be going on. Some of the older people remembered stories their grandparents told them about spirits that lived in the mountains long before any settlers came to those areas. They talked about places where the line between worlds was thin, and things that shouldn't exist could cross over to our side. But the younger generation quickly put an end to these stories, calling them silly superstitions from a time when people were less educated. And then came the time that would change everything for the people of Thornwood. It was a very cold night in November, and the first frost of winter was starting to form on the windows of the houses. The moon was full, and it cast a silver light over the mountains. The silence was so deep that every sound seemed louder. This is when the event happened on the Whitmore property, which was on the northern edge of the village. The forest was thicker there, and the neighbors were farther away. Jonathan Whitmore was a middle-aged man who was strong and practical. He was known for being skeptical of the strange stories that were going around in the village. He had made fun of people who talked about strange lights and voices in the woods, saying it was all due to fertile imagination and a lot of people being scared. Elizabeth, his wife, was more careful but trusted her husband's judgment and tried to keep things normal in their daily lives. They lived in a simple but well-built house. They grew crops in the fields around their house and kept their tools and food for the winter in a small barn. Around 10 o'clock that night, Elizabeth was finishing up the dishes from dinner when she heard something that made her stop right away. There was a sound coming from the barn, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. She called Jonathan, who was reading by the fire, and he took his flashlight and went to look, still thinking it was just a raccoon or some other animal looking for food. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and watched her husband's flashlight light sway as he walked across the yard to the barn. Jonathan opened the barn door and held up his lantern to light up the inside. The tools were hanging where they should be, and the sacks of grain were stacked against the wall. But then he saw something strange in the barn's far corner. There were marks on the floor that looked like someone had dragged something heavy around in a circle. The marks were deep and carved into the wood in a way that didn't make sense. He walked over to get a better look, and that's when he felt it. Someone was there. He couldn't see or hear it clearly, but it was clear that the air around him had become heavier and thicker. Jonathan turned quickly, the lantern shaking in his hand, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows of the roof beams and the cold wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. He was getting ready to leave when he heard a voice. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was clear that a voice was coming from somewhere inside the barn. Jonathan Whitmore's heart started to race, and for the first time in his life, he felt real fear. He quickly left the barn, locked the door, and went home, where he found Elizabeth waiting for him with worry. Elizabeth turned pale when he told her what he had seen and heard. She made them stay up all night with all the windows and doors locked. Jonathan agreed, but they both knew that things had changed. They had lost the sense of safety they had, the belief that everything had a logical reason. They stayed in the room, keeping the fire going, and waited for morning. But the dawn brought even more unsettling news. Jonathan went back outside to look at the barn again when the sun came up. This time it was bright and sunny. What he found made him speechless. He was sure he had locked the barn door the night before, but it was wide open and everything inside had been stolen. There were tools all over the floor, and sacks of grain had been ripped open. In the middle of the barn was something that made his blood run cold. There was a strange symbol on the floor that looked like it was made of ashes. It was a complicated geometric shape with lines that crossed each other in a way that made you feel hypnotized. Jonathan didn't know what the symbol meant, but it made him feel very uneasy, as if looking at it for too long could make something bad happen. When Elizabeth saw the symbol, she put her hands over her mouth. She had followed her husband to the barn. she knew that mark. When she was younger, her grandmother, who had grown up in the mountains and knew the old stories, had shown her similar drawings and told her never to copy them or play with them. Her grandmother said they were old symbols that people used to try to talk to things that should stay on the other side. Elizabeth had never taken it seriously, thinking it was just a story from the area, but now that she saw it drawn on the floor of her own barn, she couldn't ignore it. Jonathan and Elizabeth quickly covered up the symbol by throwing dirt over it until it was no longer visible. Then they locked the barn again. They didn't tell anyone what had happened because they were afraid of being made fun of, or worse, that talking about it would bring even more unwanted attention. But the secret was too much for them to handle, and in the days that followed, both of them noticed changes in themselves. Elizabeth started having vivid nightmares. In these dreams, she walked through the mountains at night and saw shadowy figures watching her from the trees. Jonathan, on the other hand, became more and more paranoid, checking the locks several times a night and jumping at any strange noise. At the same time, other people who lived in Thornwood started to tell similar stories. Dorothy Chen, a woman who lived alone after her husband died, woke up one morning to find all of her windows open, even though she was sure she had closed them before going to sleep. Henry Blake, a farmer, found out that his horse, which was usually calm and obedient, had broken through the fences during the night and was running in circles in the field with its eyes wide open in fear. Henry had never had this happen before, but when he tried to calm it down, the animal almost trampled him. Pastor Mand knew things were getting out of hand and decided to do something. He asked everyone in the village to come to a special church meeting. The church was full the night of the meeting, with pale faces and tired eyes filling the pews. Moreland went up to the pulpit and started to talk. His voice bounced off the wooden walls. He talked about faith, how important it is to stay together and not let fear take over. But even as he spoke, he could tell that his words weren't getting through to the people as they should have. Fear had taken hold too deeply. Then, something happened that no one saw coming. During Moreland's sermon, all the candles in the church went out at the same time, leaving the room completely dark. The place was completely quiet, except for the sound of nervous breathing and the creaking of the wooden pews. Then, from somewhere deep inside the church, a voice started to speak. It wasn't English. It was an older language that no one knew, but that everyone felt had a terrible weight. The whisper grew louder and louder, filling the church, until someone yelled and people started to run toward the doors. When the church doors finally opened and the people rushed out, the night was strangely quiet. It was as if nothing had happened in Thornwood, and the cold mountain air felt normal again. Some of the braver people went back inside the church with lit lanterns to look for an explanation for what had happened. The candles were all out, but there was no wind or draft that could have blown them all out at once. Pastor Moreland stood in the pulpit, pale and shaking, unable to say anything that would make people feel better or explain what had happened. Everyone in Thornwood had trouble sleeping that night. Families stayed up all night talking quietly and keeping the lights on. Everyone felt like something had changed at its core, as if they had crossed an invisible line and couldn't go back. Some people started to talk about leaving the village and going to bigger cities where civilization seemed stronger, and the darkness of the mountains didn't go as deep. But it wasn't easy to decide to leave Thornwood. For most families, that land was the result of years of hard work and sacrifice. Their farms, houses, and everything else they owned was there. If they gave up everything, they would have to start over in a strange place with no guarantee of finding work or a place to live. And there was also a part of them that wouldn't leave, a stubborn pride that made them face whatever was going on. During this time of uncertainty, a stranger showed up in Thornwood. On a foggy December morning, he rode a gray horse down the dirt road that led to the village. He called himself Marcus Hole and said he studied things that couldn't be explained. He traveled through the Appalachian Mountains to collect stories and try to figure out the mysteries they held. He was tall and thin, with dark eyes that looked like they could see more than they should. He had a leather bag full of books and notebooks full of notes. Marcus asked if he could stay at the small inn where a few travelers passing through Thornwood met. Ruth Campbell, the innkeeper, was an old woman who was unsure at first, but she agreed when she saw the chance to make some extra money. Marcus moved into an upstairs room and right away started exploring the village, asking questions and paying close attention to the stories of the people who lived there. People didn't trust him at first. People didn't like strangers in normal times, and they definitely didn't like them now that everyone was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But Marcus spoke in a way that made people feel safe. He was always calm, which was the opposite of the fear that gripped the village. He didn't make fun of people's experiences or try to give simple answers. Instead, he listened carefully and took detailed notes in his notebooks, asking specific questions about things that other people might have missed. Elizabeth Whitmore was the last person to tell Marcus about the symbol that had been drawn on her barn. She did it in secret and told him to come by when Jonathan was working in the fields. Marcus agreed, and when he saw the place where the symbol had been covered up with dirt, he asked if he could dig it up and look at it. Elizabeth wasn't sure, but Marcus's serious tone made her believe he could help. They worked together to carefully remove the dirt until the symbol could be seen again. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. He was looking closely at the mark's lines and curves. He then pulled out one of his books and quickly flipped through it, comparing the symbol to old drawings that were written down on the yellowed pages. At last, he found something that made his eyes pop. He told Elizabeth that the symbol was part of an old tradition, a way to mark territory or open doors between different states of being. It was not something to be taken lightly. Elizabeth shivered as she listened to Marcus. She wanted to know what this meant for her and Jonathan, and if they were in danger. Marcus told the truth. He said he didn't know everything, but the fact that that symbol was there made him think that something had been awakened or drawn to that place. He said the best thing to do was to cover the symbol again and stay away from the barn as much as possible. He also said that what was going on at Thornwood was bigger than just that one event. Marcus spent the next few days talking to more people who lived there, gathering stories and making maps of the places where the strange things had happened the most. He saw a pattern. All the events seemed to happen in a certain area north of the village, where the forest was older and denser. People who lived there instinctively stayed away from it, and even the most experienced hunters wouldn't go there without a good reason. Marcus thought he should go check out that area himself. At an unplanned meeting at the inn, he said what he wanted to do, and a few villagers tried to talk him out of it. Dorothy Chen was especially angry, saying that no one who went into that part of the forest with bad intentions ever came back sane. But Marcus was set on it. He had spent years studying things like this and thought he was close to figuring out something important. But he agreed not to go by himself. Pastor Mand, who thought it was his job to keep those in his care safe, offered to go with him. So did Henry Blake, the farmer whose horse had gone crazy. The next morning, the three men headed north toward the forest. The sky was gray, and the clouds were low and seemed to be pushing against the mountains. A cold wind blew through the valleys. They walked along a narrow path that disappeared among the trees. With each step, they went deeper into a place where the sun barely reached. The trees there were very old, with thick trunks covered in moss and roots that looked like claws gripping the ground. The silence was heavy, and the only sounds were their own footsteps and heavy breathing. They walked for over an hour before they found a small, round clearing. There was something in the middle of the clearing that made the three men stop right away. It was a stone building that was partly hidden by plants, but it was clear that people had built it. The stones were big and not very even, and they were arranged in a circle that was almost perfect. In the middle was what looked like a well or a hole in the ground. Marcus walked up slowly, looking at every part of the building with care. Mand and Blake stayed on the edge of the clearing, looking very uncomfortable. As Marcus knelt by the stone well and tried to see what was inside, the pastor whispered a prayer. The opening went down at a steep angle and then disappeared into complete darkness. Marcus threw a small rock into the well, hoping to hear it hit the bottom. But the sound never came. The stone just disappeared into the silence, as if it had been eaten by a bottomless pit. That's when they heard it. A low, steady whisper coming from inside the well that sounded like it was calling them. Marcus instinctively pulled back, and the three men looked at each other, knowing, without saying a word, that they had found the source of Thornwood's problems. But just because they found the source didn't mean they understood it or knew how to stop it. In fact, that discovery only proved that they were dealing with something they couldn't understand. The three men left the clearing without saying a word, each lost in their own dark thoughts. The way back felt longer and more oppressive than the way there, as if the forest were watching them and waiting to hurt them. Marcus kept his eyes on the ground in front of him and nervously held on to the handle of his leather suitcase. Mand whispered parts of prayers, looking for comfort in words he knew, while Blake kept looking over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was following them through the trees. It was like they could breathe again when they finally came out of the trees and saw the village of Thornwood again. But that feeling of relief didn't last long. They knew something was wrong when they got close to the first houses. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the streets were empty and there was an eerie silence. All the doors and windows were closed. Marcus's chest felt tight, so he hurried to the inn where Ruth Campbell usually made dinner at that time of day. The door to the boarding house was open and moving slightly in the wind. Marcus slowly pushed it open and went in, calling out Ruth's name. No one answered. It looked like something violent had happened in the main room. Chairs were turned over, and broken dishes were on the floor. Moreland and Blake followed him, their faces pale when they saw him. Marcus quickly went up the stairs and looked in each room, but there was no one there. The boarding house was empty. They went outside and started banging on the doors of nearby houses and shouting to the people inside. Finally, a door opened a little, and Dorothy Chen's scared face showed up. She quickly pulled them inside and locked the door again. As soon as they walked in, they saw a lot of families gathered in the main room of the house. They were all scared and tired. Dorothy spoke softly about what had happened while they were in the woods. Around noon, when most people were busy with their daily tasks, something happened that everyone described in the same way, even though they were in different places. The sky, which had been cloudy but mostly clear, suddenly got a lot darker, as if a black curtain had been drawn over the sun. It wasn't an eclipse or a normal storm. It was a thick, heavy darkness that felt like it had its own weight. People outside ran home, and those inside locked their doors and windows, feeling a fear they couldn't explain. During the hour of darkness, strange sounds echoed through the village. Heavy footsteps echoed through the streets as something big moved from house to house, stopping in front of each door as if it were making a decision. Some people said they heard voices calling their names, voices that sounded like those of dead loved ones begging to be let in. But everyone knew deep down that opening any door during that darkness would be a terrible mistake that couldn't be undone. Dorothy said that Ruth Campbell, the landlady, had made this mistake. Ruth was the only one in the boarding house when it got dark. Neighbors heard screams coming from the building, and then there was complete silence. When the light came back on and some brave men went to check it out, they found the boarding house empty and messy, but there was no sign of Ruth. She had just disappeared, and there was no sign of where she had gone or what had happened to her. Marcus felt a heavy weight of guilt fall on him. He had come to Thornwood to learn more about the mountain's secrets, but his presence and his investigation seemed to have sped things up and made them worse. He thought about the stone building in the woods, the well that looked like it had no bottom, and wondered if they had somehow disturbed or awakened something that should have been left alone. Pastor Mand put a hand on his shoulder, as if he could feel the man's mind racing with troubled thoughts. That night, everyone who still lived in Thornwood came to Dorothy's house because it was the biggest and most central. No one wanted to be alone, and everyone agreed that being together made them feel at least a little safer. Marcus spent hours reading through his books and notebooks by candlelight, looking for an old story or reference that could help them deal with what they were going through. He found bits and pieces of protective rituals and symbols that were said to keep bad things away, but nothing that was certain to work. Elizabeth Whitmore, one of the people there, walked up to Marcus and asked in a quiet voice if he thought they were all going to die there. Marcus couldn't lie when he looked into her tired and scared eyes. He said he didn't know what would happen, but there was still a chance as long as they stayed together and kept their hopes up. They weren't the most comforting words, but they were true, and that seemed to mean more than empty promises. As the night went on, they heard the noises again. Footsteps outside, going around the house slowly. The sound of something being dragged along the outside wall, and a constant scratching that made everyone's hair stand on end. Some people started to cry quietly, others prayed with more passion, and some just sat still, staring at the locked doors and windows, hoping they would stay shut. Marcus got up and walked to the nearest window. He carefully looked through a gap in the curtains. He could see things moving in the dark outside, where the moonlight was weak. They weren't really solid. They were more like thick shadows that looked like people but were wrong in ways that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them. They moved in a way that didn't seem natural, gliding across the ground without actually touching it. They came closer to and farther away from the house in a way that looked almost like a ritual. Henry Blake joined Marcus at the window, and the two men stood there in silence for a few minutes. Finally, Blake whispered the question that everyone was thinking, but was too scared to say. What did those things want? Marcus shook his head slowly. He had theories and ideas based on old stories and bits of information, but they weren't real. Maybe they were beings that lived on the edges of reality and were drawn to something in Thornwood. Or maybe they were manifestations of something much older, something that lived in those mountains long before anyone thought of building a village there. Pastor Mand heard what they were talking about and came over to suggest that they do some kind of protection ritual. He didn't know how to do things like that. His faith had always been simpler and more straightforward. But at that point, he was willing to try anything. Marcus agreed and started showing the people there how to make a circle of protection with salt, which Dorothy had in her pantry, and words that he had copied from one of his old books. They worked together to put salt all around the doors and windows, making a barrier that went all the way around the house. Marcus led the recitation, and even though he was scared, his voice was strong. The others repeated what he said, even though they didn't fully understand what it meant. It was an act of desperation, but also of defiance, because they didn't want to just accept what was happening. After they were done, there was a moment of silence, and then, to everyone's surprise, the sounds from outside stopped. The silence that came after was almost worse than the sounds that came before. It was as if the things outside were thinking about and judging the new wall that had been built. Marcus didn't let himself relax because he knew this could be just a short break. He told everyone to stay inside the circle of salt and not cross the lines for any reason until dawn. The next few hours were a tense vigil, during which every little sound made hearts race and eyes roll back quickly. Jonathan Whitmore broke the silence at about 3 o'clock in the morning. He was sitting in a corner with his eyes on a blank spot on the wall when he suddenly started to talk in a low voice. He wasn't talking to anyone in the room. He was just answering questions that only he could hear. Elizabeth ran to him, calling his name and trying to bring him back, but Jonathan seemed to be in a trance. His words were broken pieces of conversations about faraway places and things that didn't make sense. Marcus quickly walked over, knowing what to do. Jonathan was being affected by something that was pulling his mind away from his body. Marcus held the man's shoulders tightly and started saying anchoring words, which are words and phrases that are meant to bring his mind back to the present. Elizabeth joined him, holding his hand and talking to him about memories they had together, like specific times in their lives. Jonathan slowly and painfully blinked his eyes and looked at the faces around him again. Jonathan was shaking and sweating a lot when he finally came to his senses. He talked about what had happened to him in a hoarse, scared voice. He said that a voice had called to him, promised him things, and shown him visions of a future where he was powerful and respected and didn't have to fight against the harsh earth of the mountains anymore. The voice had been tempting, convincing, and almost impossible to say no to. He was sure that if Marcus and Elizabeth hadn't stopped him, he would have walked right through the doors and out of the house to find whatever was waiting for him outside. This event made it clear to everyone that the entities had not given up. They were just changing their approach and looking for ways to get around the physical defenses by attacking the residents' minds directly. Marcus told everyone to stay alert, not let their minds wander, talk to each other, and stay grounded in the reality they all shared. It was now a fight to see who could last the longest, and they had to last until dawn. Dorothy Chen started to sing an old song her mother used to sing to her when she was little. It wasn't a religious song. It was about clear rivers and green fields, sunny days, and hard work. Others joined in, and their voices made an imperfect but heartfelt melody. The music seemed to help them all feel connected, reminding them of life and humanity in the dark. The hours dragged on in a painful way. Marcus kept looking through his notes to see if there was any other information that could help him. He came across a passage in one of his oldest books that talked about places of power in the mountains, where the line between worlds was naturally thinner. These places might be portals, or doorways for things that don't usually have access to our world. The stone building they found in the woods was definitely like that. The book also said that these portals could be closed and sealed by doing certain rituals at the exact spot. It was risky and needed to be close to the problem, but it was doable. Marcus thought about telling the others about this, but he wasn't sure. It felt like asking someone to go back to that forest and clearing was like asking them to walk straight to their death. But how long could they really last if they did nothing and just waited and tried to stay alive? Pastor Mann saw Marcus reading the book so closely that he went up to him and asked what he had found. Marcus talked in a low voice and pointed to the parts that were important. Mann read carefully, and his lips moved silently as he thought about what he was reading. He looked at Marcus with a serious but determined look when he was done. Moreland said, if there was a chance to end this, then they needed to try. They couldn't just wait for things to get better on their own. They decided to wait until dawn to make a final decision. It felt like a weight had been lifted when the first light of day came through the windows and lit up the sky. The dark shapes that had been around the house all night were gone when the light came on. Marcus slowly opened the front door and stepped outside, looking around. The village in the mountains was quiet again, and the winter light was dim. But everyone knew that normalcy was just an illusion. Marcus got a small group together to talk about the plan. Henry Blake, along with Pastor Mann, insisted on going. He felt he owed it to Ruth Campbell to go because he had survived when she had not. Jonathan Whitmore, who was still shaken by what happened to him during the night, also volunteered, saying he couldn't just sit back and watch others risk their lives. Elizabeth begged him not to leave, but Jonathan wouldn't budge. He had to do this for himself and for everyone else. They spent the morning getting ready, gathering supplies, and going over the ritual they would have to do. Marcus wrote down the important steps from his book on a piece of paper so that everyone could understand them. As part of the ritual, they had to make a protective circle around the stone structure, say certain words to get rid of it, and then seal the opening with a mix of salt, iron, and holy earth. It didn't sound too hard, but Marcus knew that the hardest part would be doing all of this while dealing with any problems that might come up. Around noon, the 4 men left for the northern forest. The day was surprisingly clear, and the sun, shining through the trees, made it seem like it was going to be a good day. But as they went deeper into the woods, following the same path as before, that feeling of light and hope started to fade. The trees seemed to close in on them, and the sun got weaker and weaker until they were back in the constant twilight that was typical of that part of the forest. When they got to the clearing, they stopped at the edge and looked around. The stone building looked the same as when they left, but the air felt different. It felt like the air itself was trying to keep them from being there. It was heavier and denser. Marcus stepped forward, holding his bag of supplies tightly. The others followed, and they formed a line as they entered the clearing. They worked quickly together to set up the protective circle around the stone building. Marcus poured salt in a straight line, and then Blake brought small pieces of iron from his farm. Mand prayed all the time, and even though his hands were shaking, his voice stayed steady. Jonathan kept an eye on things, always looking around the edges of the clearing for any sign of movement or danger. They felt the change just as they were about to finish the circle. The temperature dropped a lot in just a few seconds, and their breath became visible in the suddenly cold air. A strange wind began to blow through the clearing. It came from all sides at once and swirled around them in a circle. Then there were the whispers. Not just one voice, but dozens, hundreds, all at once. It was a loud, confusing noise that made their heads hurt. Marcus yelled for them to keep going, but it was hard to hear him over the whispers that were now filling the clearing. He knew that stopping now would mean death, and that any delay would give the people around him the chance they needed. He finished the circle of salt and iron with shaking hands, closing the protective line around the stone building. When the circle was closed, there was a burst of energy that pushed them back, making them trip but not fall all the way. Pastor Mand was the first to get better. He knelt on the cold floor of the clearing and began to say the words that Marcus had taught him to get rid of the evil. His voice was strong now, thanks to a faith that had been tried and not broken. Blake and Jonathan joined him, repeating the words even though they didn't fully understand what they meant. They trusted that the meaning behind them was what really mattered. Marcus opened his book and looked for the exact passage that talked about the final sealing. His fingers were numb from the cold. The shadows at the clearing's edge started to move and take on more defined shapes. They were tall, misshapen shapes that shook at the edges, as if they couldn't stay in the same shape on this plane of existence. They didn't go into the clearing. Instead, they went around it in a way that looked like the wind blowing around the men. They had an eager look about them, as if they were waiting for the men to make a mistake, a small mistake that would let them step in. Marcus found the part he was looking for and started to say the last words of the ceremony. They were words in a language he didn't know well, a mix of sounds that sounded older than any language spoken by people today. He poured the prepared mixture of consecrated earth over the opening of the stone well as he spoke. He watched it disappear into the darkness below. For a moment, nothing happened, and Marcus's fear grew that the ritual hadn't worked, and that the whole trip had been for nothing. Then there was a noise coming from the bottom of the well. It was different from whispers. It was deeper and more basic, like the sound of something huge being forced to move after hundreds of years of not moving. The ground beneath their feet shook a little, and cracks appeared in the stone structure, spreading out from the center. The dark shapes at the edge of the clearing started to move around violently, their movements becoming erratic and frantic, as if they knew something was changing and that they were losing their connection to this place. Jonathan felt something touch him, a cold presence that tried to pull him out of the protective circle and wrap around him. He held on to Blake's arm and fought against the unseen force that was pulling him. Blake held him tightly, putting his feet on the ground and not letting his friend be taken. Mand moved quickly, putting himself between Jonathan and the edge of the circle. He held out his free hand as a sign of rejection and kept saying the banishing words. Marcus finished the last part of the ritual by pressing a piece of cold iron against the edge of the well opening. For a brief moment, there was complete silence, as if everyone in the world was holding their breath. Then, with a sound that was both a sigh and a cry, the shadowy figures started to fade away, their shapes breaking up like smoke being blown away by a strong wind. The intense cold started to fade, and the clearing let in more natural light, which pushed the shadows back. The four men stood still for a few minutes, not believing it was over. Finally, Marcus got close to the stone structure and looked it over carefully. The cracks that had formed during the ritual were now bigger, and when he looked inside the well, he saw that it was closed, with dirt and rocks inside where there had only been a black void before. The door, if that's what it really was shut. They slowly left the clearing, their bodies tired, but their minds at ease. This time, the trip back through the woods was different. The trees didn't look scary anymore. The path was clearer, and the ground around them felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. When they finally got out of the trees and saw Thornwood in the distance, it was like they were seeing it for the first time. The village quickly heard about their success. The villagers who had stayed in Dorothy's house came out slowly, testing the air and noticing the change. It was hard to say what had changed, but everyone could feel it. The oppression that had been hanging over Thornwood for weeks was gone, and in its place was something more like peace. It wasn't perfect. There would still be scars, but the danger was over. Elizabeth ran to Jonathan, hugged him tightly, and cried tears of relief. Dorothy thanked each man for being brave by hugging them. Others came up and said thank you, or did something nice to show their appreciation. But there was a sad note in the middle of the celebration. Ruth Campbell was still missing. She had been taken on that awful day when the village was covered in darkness. There was no way to get her back, and no ritual that could fix what had been done. For the next few days, Marcus wrote down everything that had happened in his notebooks. He talked to everyone who was willing to share their stories, making a full record of what happened at Thornwood. He knew that this information could be useful to other people who might find themselves in similar situations, in other places where the line between worlds was too thin. But he also knew that there were things about the experience that couldn't be put into words or understood logically. For his part, Pastor Mand spent a lot of time in quiet thought. What he had been through had made him question many of his previous ideas about what reality and God are like. He still believed, but his faith had changed. It had grown to include the idea that the world was much bigger and more mysterious than he had ever thought. In his later sermons, he talked less about what was certain and more about what was unknown. He also talked less about judgment and more about compassion in the face of the unknown. As winter got worse and the snow started to cover the mountains around Thornwood, life slowly started to get back to normal. People went back to their normal lives, taking care of their farms and getting ready for the cold months ahead. But what they had been through had changed everyone. Now, everyone knew that the world had depths that most people would never have to explore, and they were glad of it. Marcus was finally ready to leave Thornwood. He had been there longer than he had planned, but he thought his work was done. Many villagers came to say goodbye to him on the morning of his departure. They gave him supplies for the trip and thanked him. Elizabeth gave him a knitted wool shawl and told him it would keep him warm on the cold mountain roads. Jonathan squeezed her hand tightly, and he didn't need to say anything to show how he felt. Before he left, Marcus went to the northern forest one last time. This time he went by himself, walking along the path he was now familiar with. The clearing was quiet and calm, and the stone building was a reminder of what had happened there. Marcus stood still for a long time, thinking about everything he had learned. He put a small stone on the building as a personal marker, then turned around and left, knowing he would never go back. Marcus's trip took him away from Thornwood along the winding roads that cut through the Appalachians, but as he rode, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had left behind. The portal was closed, so the village was definitely safer now. But Marcus knew that wasn't the end of the story. The mountains were huge and had a lot of hidden places and old secrets. The problems they had in Thornwood were just a small part of a much bigger problem, a web of mysteries that covered the whole area. Life in Thornwood went on as usual during the winter. The snow fell hard, covering the fields and rooftops, and making everything it touched look clean. People worked together more than they had before, and they became friends because they had all been through hard times. Dorothy Chen often opened her home to the community so that everyone could come together, eat, and just be together. It was a way to fight the loneliness that always came with winter in the mountains. Henry Blake started to write. He had never thought about doing it before, but he felt the need to write down his own version of what happened, not as an academic paper like Marcus had done, but as a personal story about how those days changed the way he saw the world. He wrote at night by candlelight, and the words came out of his pen in a way that surprised him. It was a way to deal with the trauma and figure out what didn't make sense. Jonathan and Elizabeth Whitmore made the decision to fix up their barn. The old one was still there, but it held memories they didn't want to keep. During the coldest weeks, they worked together to cut new wood and build a new, clean structure. It was hard work, especially in the cold, but it was also good for my mental health. It helped me take back that space and make it into something new. They painted the walls a bright red color that stood out against the white snow around them when they were done. Pastor Mann started to have different types of services at his church. In addition to the usual Sunday services, he let people come in on weekday afternoons to sit in silence, meditate, or talk about what they had been through. He found that a lot of people needed a place to think about what had happened and talk about their fears and doubts without being judged. The church was no longer just a place to worship. It was also a place for everyone to heal together. As January 1909 drew near, a very bad snowstorm hit Thornwood, cutting it off from the rest of the world for almost 2 weeks. The roads were blocked, and the village was cut off from the rest of the world. But this time, being alone didn't scare them. The people had learned how strong they could be when they worked together. They shared food and other supplies, checked on their neighbors often, and kept their spirits up with stories, music, and just being with each other. Dorothy started teaching some of the younger women the old sewing and weaving skills her grandmother had taught her during those 2 weeks. It was a way to keep knowledge alive and make something beautiful in the middle of winter's harshness. They worked together in Dorothy's house, talking about their hopes and plans for the future, while their hands were busy with needles and threads. Something unexpected happened at this time. When the storm was over and the sun was shining on the snowy landscape, someone knocked on Dorothy's door one morning. When she opened the door, she saw a woman she didn't know standing on her porch, covered in snow and shivering. The woman was confused and couldn't clearly say who she was or where she came from. Dorothy brought her inside right away, wrapped her in blankets, and gave her hot tea. Details slowly started to come out as the woman warmed up. Her name was Sarah, and she had been hiking in the mountains when the storm hit, and she got lost. She had been lost for days, and she had survived the cold through sheer will and luck. But there was something strange about her story. Things didn't quite add up. When people asked her about specific parts of her journey, she didn't give clear answers, as if she didn't know what had happened. Pastor Mand was asked to talk to Sarah, and during that talk he started to have a bad feeling about something. Sarah's description of the places she had been to didn't match up with any real parts of the mountains near Thornwood. She talked about valleys that weren't real and rock formations that weren't on any map. It was like she had been in a place that was in the same physical space as the real world but was a little different, as if it were out of place. If Marcus were still there, he would have seen the signs right away. Somehow, Sarah had crossed into one of the liminal spaces that were hidden in the mountains and had found her way back. But Mand, who now had a better understanding of the world, also started to figure out what had happened. The question was what to do with this information and how to help Sarah deal with something she could barely put into words. They chose not to push her for answers that she clearly didn't have. Instead, they gave her a place to stay and kept her safe so she could get better at her own pace. Sarah stayed at Thornwood for a few weeks and slowly got used to life again. She did chores around the house, went to community meetings, and over time, the holes in her memory started to fill in, though some parts stayed blank for good. During this time, the people who lived in Thornwood began to understand something about their own neighborhood. They had unknowingly become a safe place for people who had been through strange things. Because of what they had been through together, they were able to accept and welcome people whose stories didn't fit with how things usually are. It was a duty they didn't want, but they handled it with surprising grace. There was a feeling of renewal in Thornwood as winter turned into spring and the snow melted, showing the dark earth below. People started to plan their plantings, fix things that had been broken by the winter, and think about their futures in ways that went beyond just staying alive. Sarah chose to stay because she found the kind of acceptance in Thornwood that she knew she wouldn't find in many other places. Thornwood started to bloom again when spring came. The fields that had been covered in snow for a long time started to show signs of life, and the trees on the mountain slopes were full of new buds. It was as if the earth itself were celebrating the end of winter by giving us bright colors and the songs of birds that had come back from faraway places. For the villagers, this change in nature seemed to reflect their own journeys from darkness to light. Sarah learned the herbal healing methods that Dorothy had learned from her ancestors while working with her. Even Dorothy was impressed by how Sarah's hands were sensitive to plants and how to use them. They worked together to grow a medicinal garden behind the house, planting roots and seeds that would grow into medicines for fevers, aches, and other illnesses that the people who lived there had all year. It was honest work that helped Sarah feel like she had a purpose that she didn't know she had before coming to Thornwood. Jonathan Whitmore started to look for good wood for building projects in the less dense parts of the forest. He found something that made him stop during one of these trips. He found a small hidden valley in a part of the forest that he was sure he had walked through dozens of times before. There was a natural spring in the middle of the valley. Clear water flowed between the rocks and made a small stream that ran down the mountain. The water was so clean that Jonathan felt a deep sense of peace as he knelt down and drank from it. He went back to the village and told everyone about what he had found. Soon, a small group went to see it for themselves. Pastor Mand was especially interested because he thought there was something special about that spring. It wasn't scary or threatening like the clearing with the stone structure had been. It was calm and almost holy. They chose to mark the way to it, making a path that anyone could follow. People went to the spring when they needed to be alone and think. It was a natural contrast to the darker areas of the mountains. Henry Blake finished his writing and, with some hesitation, gave it to a few people in the community. The answer was very touching. His words not only told the truth about what happened, but they also showed how everyone felt and how they changed inside. Dorothy told him to keep the manuscript in a safe place so that future generations could read it. Blake agreed and put the document in a metal box that he buried under the floorboards of his house, marking the spot so no one would see it. As April went on, news from other parts of the Appalachians started to come in. People who traveled through Thornwood from time to time told stories of strange things happening in faraway villages. These stories sounded strangely familiar to those who had lived through the events of the previous winter. There were reports of strange lights, sounds in the woods, and people having experiences that couldn't be easily explained. It looked like what happened in Thornwood wasn't just a one-time thing, but part of a bigger pattern that ran through the mountains. This realization made me feel both good and bad. It was comforting to know that they weren't the only ones who had gone through something strange. On the other hand, it was scary to think that so many places could be in danger of the same thing that almost destroyed their community. Pastor Mann started writing letters to other village pastors, sharing what they had learned and giving each other advice. It was an informal network of information and a way for people who were on the fringes of normal life to get help. Sarah started having very real dreams during this time. These weren't the nightmares that had bothered her when she first got there. They were different. She dreamed of places in the mountains, specific places that stood out in her mind with surprising clarity. When she talked about these places with other people, especially Mand and Dorothy, they knew some of them were real places that were close by. In a way, Sarah was mapping out the area through her dreams, marking places that were important to her. A cave on the upper slopes of the mountain east of Thornwood was one of the places that kept showing up in her dreams. Sarah couldn't say why she needed to find this cave, only that there was something important there that she needed to understand. She finally got the guts to plan a trip after weeks of dreaming about the same place. Dorothy insisted on going with her, and so did Jonathan, who had become something of an unofficial guide for anyone who wanted to explore the mountains around them. The climb to the cave was hard because they had to walk over rocks and up steep trails that pushed their bodies to the limit. Sarah knew right away that they had found the right place when they got to the cave entrance. The entrance was small and hard to find because it was hidden behind a thick growth of bushes and vines. Jonathan cut down the plants, revealing a path that led down the mountain. They turned on their flashlights and carefully went inside. The inside of the cave was surprisingly big, with a high ceiling and smooth walls that looked like they had been shaped by water over many years. But the markings on the walls were what really caught their attention. They weren't scary symbols like the ones they had seen before. Instead, they were old drawings and paintings of people, animals, and geometric patterns that made them feel calm. It was clear that they were very old and made by people who lived in those mountains long before any Europeans came to settle there. Sarah walked through the cave as if she were in a trance, her fingers lightly following the patterns on the walls. Dorothy and Jonathan followed her in silence, knowing that they were seeing something important. They found something amazing deep inside the cave, in a room that opened up from the main tunnel. There was a thin layer of white sand on the floor, and in the middle was a circle of small, smooth stones arranged in a complicated pattern that looked both random and planned at the same time. Sarah knelt down next to the circle of stones and shut her eyes. When she opened them again, tears were running down her face. She told Jonathan and Dorothy that she finally got it. That cave was a place of protection, a sanctuary created by those who had understood the complex nature of the mountains long before them. The marks on the walls were more than just art. They were instructions and maps of both physical and spiritual places. The circle of stones on the floor was a focal point, and an anchor that helped keep the different parts of reality that came together in that place in balance. They spent hours in the cave looking at the markings and trying to figure out what they meant. They couldn't figure out everything. Some meanings were still unclear, But they understood enough to know that they weren't the first to face the mountain's mysteries, and that those who came before them had left advice for those who would come after them. It was a comforting sense of continuity, a link across time that made their own problems seem like they were part of something bigger and more important. The sky was turning orange and pink as they left the cave. The trip down the mountain was faster than the trip up, and by the time they got back to Thornwood, it was dark. They told Pastor Mand about what they had found, and he was very moved by what they said. He saw it as proof of something he had always thought, that people have always looked for ways to understand and protect themselves from the unknown, no matter what time or culture they lived in. Over the next few months, Thornwood changed in a small but big way. Finding the cave had changed how the people who lived there saw their home. It was no longer just a piece of land in the mountains that was far away from everything else. It was part of a much older and more important landscape that had been seen as special by many generations. This knowledge gave them both a sense of duty and a strange sense of comfort, as if they were part of a bigger story that would go on long after they were gone. Sarah took on the role of unofficial guardian of the cave. She went there often, sometimes by herself, and other times with people who needed a break or some clarity. She saw that being in the cave made people feel better, as if the space itself had an energy that helped them organize their thoughts and calm their troubled minds. She started writing down her thoughts in a small diary. She wrote down not only her own experiences, but also the stories of people who came to the cave. Thornwood got an unexpected visitor in the summer. On a hot July day, Marcus Holley came back, riding down the dirt road. He looked a little different. He seemed thinner and more tired, but his eyes still sparkled with the intense curiosity that was so typical of him. He said that since he left, he had been traveling through the Appalachians and writing down other places where similar things had happened. His leather bag was now even fuller of notebooks and maps, which were becoming a growing collection of information about the mountain's secrets. It was a warm and emotional reunion between Marcus and the people of Thornwood. They ate together and told him stories about what had happened since he left. Marcus got very excited when Sarah told him about the cave and the old paintings. He asked to go there right away, and Sarah said yes. She planned a trip for the next day. This time, a bigger group went, including Pastor Mand, Elizabeth Whitmore, and Henry Blake. They were all excited to see Marcus see that special place for the first time. They knew exactly how Marcus would react when he entered the cave. He stood at the door for a long time, just taking in the mood of the place. Then, slowly, he walked over to the walls and looked at the paintings very closely. He pulled out a notebook and started to draw quick sketches, writing down details and how they compared to other places he had been. He moved with respect, knowing that he was in the presence of something very important. As soon as they got to the inner room with the stone circle, Marcus sat on the floor and didn't say anything for almost an hour. The other people waited patiently because they understood that he needed time to deal with what was happening. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, but it was clear in the quiet cave. He said he had been to similar places on his travels, sanctuaries made by ancient people who knew how complicated the land was, but none had been kept so well or so clearly on purpose as this one. It was a treasure trove of knowledge, he said, and Thornwood had a sacred duty to keep it safe. This time, Marcus spent a few weeks in Thornwood, working with Sarah and others to write down everything they could find out about the cave. They carefully copied the paintings, measured the size of the room, and tried to figure out what the patterns in the stone circle meant. Marcus shared what he had learned from his other research, linking different places and finding patterns that were the same in all of them. It was very detailed work that was sometimes frustrating because he didn't understand a lot of things, but it was also very rewarding. Something interesting started to happen during this time. People from other villages began to learn about Thornwood and the lives of the people who lived there, Some people went there just to talk to people who had been through the unexplainable and lived. People who wanted to know more about parts of reality that mainstream society liked to ignore or make fun of were slowly turning Thornwood into a place to go for answers. No one saw it coming, but it felt like it was meant to happen. Pastor Mand ended up counseling not only people who came to his church, but also people who came from far away. He came up with a way to combine his old beliefs with what he had learned at Thornwood. He talked about mystery with respect, saying that it's important to stay open to the unknown while still holding on to basic values like compassion and community. Many people who felt stuck between worlds and couldn't make sense of their strange experiences with normal beliefs connected with what he said. Elizabeth Whitmore started letting travelers who were going to Thornwood stay in her home. She and Jonathan had completely fixed up their property and had room for guests. Elizabeth found out that she was naturally good at making people feel safe and welcome, which made it possible for them to tell their stories without worrying about being judged. People who would never have met otherwise made connections at the Whitmore dining table during many meaningful conversations. As August came to an end and summer started to turn into fall, Marcus got ready to leave again. This time, though, he left more than just memories behind. He gave the community copies of his most important notes, which were carefully put together into books. They were useful guides on how to spot places of power, how to stay safe from bad influences, and how to tell the difference between things that were just strange and things that were really dangerous. It was a priceless gift, the result of years of study and experience. The night before he left, the church held a special meeting for the community. It wasn't a normal religious service. Instead, it was a party to celebrate everything they had been through and learned together. People told stories, sang songs, and thanked each other for the strength and support they had given each other during the hardest times. Marcus said a few words to thank them for their bravery and for letting him be a part of their journey. He said he would come back whenever he could, and everyone knew he would keep his word. There was a feeling of completion in the air when Marcus left the next morning, riding north toward the mountains. But it wasn't a feeling of finality. The story of Thornwood wasn't over. It was just starting a new chapter. The village had changed from a scary place full of secrets to a safe place where people could understand and accept each other. They would always have the scars of what they had been through, but they would also always have the lessons they had learned and the bonds they had made through the shared fire. Sarah was on the porch of Dorothy's house, watching Marcus walk away. She thought about her own journey, how she had come to Thornwood lost and confused, and how she had found a home and a purpose. The mountains around her were still strange, with places that were hard to understand, but she wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had learned that mystery didn't mean danger, that the unknown could be handled with care and respect, and that the journey of understanding was just as important as the final destination. The colors of autumn made the Appalachian Mountains look brighter than ever. The red, orange, and gold colors that covered the slopes around Thornwood were beautiful and very different from the darkness that had been there months before. It was like nature was reminding us that the light always comes back after a dark time. The pace of life in the village became calm and comforting. People went about their daily lives, picking the last summer vegetables, getting firewood ready for the coming winter, and gathering around campfires as the nights got colder. In those simple times, they felt at peace and grateful for the things they had once taken for granted. The sound of laughter came back to the streets, and the doors that had been locked for so long were now open to neighbors and visitors. Sarah kept going to the cave in the mountains and bringing people who wanted to think about things. The place became a symbol of something bigger than any of them could fully explain. It was a place where the weight of the everyday world seemed lighter, and where new ways of looking at things came to mind. She never tried to explain what happened there too much. She wanted everyone to have their own experience and come to their own conclusions. Pastor Mann's sermons took on a new depth as he talked less about strict rules and more about the journey of people through uncertainty. People could feel what he said because it came from a real place, not just a theory or a tradition. He had walked through darkness and come out changed, and that change made everything he said more important and real. The church became a real place of healing, where people could ask questions and get answers. Jonathan and Elizabeth were happy again in their life together. The things they had been through had brought them closer together in ways they never thought were possible. They worked together on their estate, planning for the future while remembering the past. They found that even the smallest things they did together now had a special meaning. They were quietly thankful for each other and for making it through. Dorothy was still the center of the community, and her home was always open to anyone who needed company, advice, or just a hot meal. She had become a kind of anchor for Thornwood, always there to provide stability in a world that had turned out to be much less stable than anyone had thought. She had learned a lot from living in the mountains for decades, but now she had a deeper understanding of the mysteries that lay beneath the surface of things. Henry Blake kept writing, not just about the past, but also about the present and what he thought about the future. He could talk more easily now, as if something inside him had been unlocked by the things he had been through. He learned that writing was a way to deal with trauma and also a way to remember the beauty that had come into their lives. There were stories of bravery and friendship, change and hope, all waiting to be told after him. As winter came around again, this time without the fear that had come with the last winter, the people of Thornwood got ready with quiet confidence. They learned a lot about how strong they were, how important it is to face the unknown with courage instead of denying it, and how important it is to be part of a community. They knew that the mountains around them still held secrets, and that there was a lot they didn't understand and might never fully understand, but this no longer scared them. As the first snow of winter began to fall softly on Thornwood, a few families met at the church one evening. The people who came together didn't have a specific reason. They just wanted to be together. They told each other old and new stories, laughed at funny memories, and thought about everything they had been through in quiet times. People were clearly thankful, not just for surviving, but also for finding meaning and purpose in their struggles. Sarah looked around the room and saw the faces lit by candlelight. She felt something deep inside. When she first got to Thornwood, she was a stranger who was lost and confused. Now, though, she was part of something bigger. She had found a chosen family, a place where she fit in. The mountains that used to scare them were now just home, with all their secrets and wonders still there. Pastor Mann ended the night with words that were simple but strong. He talked about journeys, how going through dark times teaches us to appreciate the light, and how facing our fears makes us stronger and more caring. He told everyone that the mountains would always keep their secrets, and that this was part of what made them beautiful and strong. "We don't need to know everything," he said. "We just need to walk with courage and stay connected to each other." When the people finally left the church and walked home through the softly falling snow, Thornwood was filled with a deep sense of peace. The village had been put through things that no one could have imagined, but it had come out stronger, not broken. The stars shone brightly in the clear winter sky. Somewhere in the distant mountains, the ancient forces that lived there watched in silence, maybe because they knew that some human communities were strong and deserved respect. And that brings us to the end of our trip through this mountain story. Thornwood is still surrounded by the timeless beauty of the Appalachian Mountains, which are a small point of light in the vast, mysterious mountains. If you liked this trip with us, think about subscribing to the channel for more stories about the dark and interesting parts of forgotten places. Please leave a comment to let us know what you thought of this story. See you on the next adventure.